The coronation of Aragorn took place in the spring, when Minas Tirith's white walls gleamed under clear skies, and the scent of new blossoms drifted up from the Pelennor fields. He stood before the fountain in the court of the fountain, and Gandalf placed the crown of Gondor upon his head, a crown that had waited centuries for the return of Isildur's heir. The people gathered in silence at first, then the silence broke into song, voices rising like birds taking flight. Aragorn wore the Star of Elendil on his brow, ancient and beautiful, catching the morning light. He spoke his oath in a voice that carried across the courtyard, promising to serve all the free peoples, to rebuild what had been broken, and to remember always that a king's duty is to his people, not his glory. The ceremony was simple as he wished it, though the joy was profound. The wedding of Aragorn and Arwen took place on Midsummer's Day in the same year, and all of Minas Tirith was adorned with flowers brought from every corner of Gondor. Arwen came from Rivendell in a procession that took weeks, traveling with her father Elrond and the last great company of elves to journey through Middle-earth. She wore a gown of silver and white, and in her hair were stars that seemed to hold their own light, gifts from her grandmother Galadriel. When she and Aragorn stood together beneath the white tree, which had just begun to bloom for the first time in centuries, witnesses said the air itself seemed to shimmer with joy. Elrond gave his daughter's hand with both pride and sorrow, knowing he was losing her to the choice she had made, to accept mortality for love. The feast lasted 7 days, and elves sang songs so beautiful that those who heard them would remember the melodies in dreams for the rest of their lives. Aragorn took the name Elessar, the Elfstone, which had been prophesied for him long ago. The name came from the great green gem he wore, a gift from Galadriel, which was said to have healing properties and had once belonged to Arendil. As King Elessar, he became a bridge between the ancient days and the New Age, carrying forward the wisdom of elves while building a kingdom for men. His first act as king was to restore the friendship between Gondor and Rohan, declaring Éomer king of the Riddermark to be his brother-in-arms and his equal in honor. He sent word to all corners of Middle-earth that the shadow had passed, that roads were safe again, that trade and travel could resume. Messengers rode to distant lands that had known only rumor and fear, bringing news that Sauron had fallen and a just king had risen. The world began, slowly, to remember what peace felt like. The white tree that bloomed in the court of the fountain was a sapling found by Gandalf and Aragorn, high on the slopes of Mount Mindoluin, in a place where snow lay even in summer. They climbed together in the evening, and Gandalf led Aragorn to a grove where the last descendant of Nimloth grew, hidden and waiting. Its bark was pale as starlight, its leaves silver green, and when they brought it down to the city and planted it where the old dead tree had stood, it took root immediately. Within days, the first blossoms appeared, white flowers with a fragrance like distant memories of Valinor. The people of Minas Tirith would gather in the courtyard just to sit near it, feeling something they couldn't quite name. A sense that their city was blessed again, that the line of kings had truly returned, that the long night was finally over. Birds that had abandoned the city during the war came back to nest in its branches. Aragorn reunited the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, becoming the first High King of both realms in over 1,000 years. Arnor had long been a scattered memory, its great cities fallen into ruin, its people dispersed into small settlements and forgotten villages. he traveled north to the ruins of Annúminas on the shores of Lake Evendim, where his ancestors had once ruled, and there he began the work of restoration. Stonemasons came from Gondor to rebuild the ancient halls, and the scattered rangers of the north, who had kept watch through long years without recognition, finally had a king to serve openly. He established Annúminas as the northern capital, though he spent much of his time in Minas Tirith, traveling between his two cities and seeing with his own eyes the lands he had once protected in secret. The Star of Elendil became the symbol of this reunited kingdom, shining on banners from the Bay of Belfalas to the northern wastes. The reconstruction of Minas Tirith began immediately after the coronation, and Aragorn oversaw every detail with the same careful attention he had once given to tracking enemies through the wilderness. The city had been scarred by siege, the outer wall breached, buildings burned, the great gate destroyed by the Witch King's assault. Gimli brought dwarven craftsmen from the Lonely Mountain, master builders who understood stone like old friends. They rebuilt the gate with mithril inlays stronger than before, decorated with images of the tree and the 7 stars and the crown. Each level of the city was restored, working from bottom to top, and as the work progressed, people who had fled during the war returned, filling empty houses with life again. Markets reopened in the lower circles, selling fruits and cloth and pottery. The sound of hammers and chisels became the new music of Minas Tirith, a sound of creation rather than destruction. Aragorn established new laws that protected the common people and limited the power of the nobility to exploit those beneath them. He had lived as a ranger, as a soldier, as a wanderer without status, and he remembered what it meant to be overlooked, to serve without recognition. He decreed that no one in Gondor would go hungry while grain stores remained, that healers would attend to anyone who needed them regardless of wealth, that justice would be available to farmer and lord alike. He walked the streets of his city without guards, stopping to speak with shopkeepers and laborers, asking about their lives and actually listening to their answers. His people loved him not because he was grand or distant, but because he had calloused hands like theirs, because he understood the worth of simple work, because when he gave his word, stone itself seemed less reliable. In council, he would quote the wisdom of hobbits and dwarves as readily as the lore of Númenor, honoring all peoples equally. The houses of healing, which had saved so many lives during and after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, were expanded into a great center of learning and care. Aragorn, who had spent years learning herb lore from the elves and understanding the properties of athelas and other healing plants, established schools where knowledge could be preserved and passed on. Healers came from Rivendell to teach, and the gardens around the houses grew thick with medicinal herbs, athelas with its sweet scent, comfrey for broken bones, willow bark for pain, lavender for sleep and calm. The air around the houses always smelled of growing things and clean water. Éowyn, who had known her own healing there, sometimes visited to walk the gardens with Faramir, and she would speak with those who were recovering from wounds both visible and hidden, offering the quiet understanding of someone who had walked through darkness and found light again. Faramir was named Steward of Gondor, as was his birthright, but the role transformed under Aragorn's kingship. No longer was the steward a ruler in all but name, holding power while the throne sat empty. Instead, Faramir became the king's most trusted counselor, the one who managed the daily governance while Aragorn traveled or met with foreign dignitaries. They worked together like two hands on the same task. Aragorn with his vision of the future, Faramir with his deep knowledge of Gondor's history and people. Faramir administered justice, oversaw trade agreements, managed the city's supplies and defenses, and he did it all with a wisdom and fairness that earned him deep respect. He and Aragorn would spend long evenings in the citadel discussing policy and philosophy, sometimes joined by Gandalf, their conversations wandering from practical matters of grain distribution to questions of how to build a lasting peace, how to help people who had known only war remember how to live without fear. Aragorn made peace with the peoples of the south and east who had served Sauron, not through subjugation but through reconciliation. He understood that many had been deceived or coerced, that the Haradrim and Easterlings were not inherently evil but had been caught in the Dark Lord's web of lies and threats. He sent ambassadors bearing gifts and offers of alliance, and though the process was slow and required patience that stretched across years, gradually borders opened and trade routes were established. Former enemies met in neutral territories to negotiate, wary at first, then gradually warming as they realized this king meant what he said. Caravans began to move along ancient roads, carrying spices and silk from the south, crafts and grain from Gondor. Cultural exchanges followed trade, musicians and storytellers traveling between lands, sharing songs, learning that the supposed monsters on the other side were simply people who loved and feared and hoped like anyone else. It was not a swift peace, but it was genuine, built on growing trust rather than domination. The Tower of Icthelion, the highest point of Minas Tirith where the stewards had kept watch for centuries, was restored and rededicated as a place of vigilance not against enemies, but as a beacon of hope. Its white stone was cleaned and repaired, and at its peak a great lamp was installed that burned every night, visible for miles across the Pelennor fields and beyond. The light used oil scented with herbs, and on clear nights the glow seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. Watchmen still stood there, but they watched for travelers in need of aid, for weather signs, for the migration of birds in spring and autumn. The tower became a symbol of Gondor's new purpose, not to stand alone in grim defense, but to shine as a center of learning and culture and welcome, a place where all peoples could look and see that someone was keeping watch, that the darkness would not return unopposed, that the age of hiding behind walls was giving way to an age of open roads and extended hands. The libraries of Minas Tirith, which had been neglected during the long years of war and vigilance, were restored and expanded under Aragorn's reign. Ancient texts that had gathered dust in forgotten corners were brought out, catalogued, and preserved. Scholars from Rivendell came to help organize the knowledge, and new scribes were trained in the art of copying manuscripts so that precious information would not be lost if a single book were damaged. The library grew to include not just the histories of Gondor and the lore of Númenor, but songs and stories from the Shire, dwarvish records of deep time and stonecraft, elvish poetry that captured the music of growing things. Reading rooms were established where anyone could come to learn, and the sound of pages turning became as common as the sound of fountain water in the courtyards. On quiet afternoons, sunlight would stream through high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny stars, and readers would lose themselves in accounts of the elder days when the world was young and full of wonders that had since passed into memory. Aragorn and Arwen had a son named Eldarion, born in the 4th year of the Fourth Age, and his birth was celebrated throughout the kingdom as a sign that the line of kings would continue, that the future was secured. He was a beautiful child with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and in him the blood of 3 kindreds mingled: the Númenóreans through Aragorn, the Eldar through Arwen, and even a distant trace of Maiar through Melian, Arwen's ancient ancestor. He grew up walking the halls of Minas Tirith, learning swordcraft from his father and lore from his mother, studying with Faramir, and listening to stories from visiting hobbits. Aragorn taught him that kingship was service, not privilege, and often took him on journeys through Gondor so he could see the lives of farmers and craftsmen, could understand that every person in the kingdom mattered. Eldarion would eventually rule after his father, continuing the dynasty for many generations. But in his childhood, he was simply a boy who loved climbing the White Tree when his parents weren't watching, who befriended the children of servants and nobles without distinction. Aragorn and Arwen also had daughters, though their names and numbers are remembered only in the most ancient records, fragments of genealogies preserved in the archives of Gondor. These daughters grew to womanhood in a time of peace their parents had fought to create, and they married into noble houses, spreading the blood of Númenor and the Eldar through the kingdoms of men. Through them, the gift of longer life and the grace that came from elvish ancestry passed into many families, though diluted with each generation, becoming eventually just a memory of something special that had once touched their line. The daughters learned music from their mother, who sang in the elvish tongue, and they learned courage from their father, who taught them that strength came not from dominance but from standing for what was right even when it was difficult. On summer evenings, the royal family would sit together in private gardens, away from ceremony and expectation, just being together, their laughter drifting on warm air scented with roses. The Pelennor fields, which had been trampled by armies and soaked with blood during the Great Battle, were consecrated as memorial grounds and then gradually returned to cultivation. Aragorn decreed that cairns would be built for the fallen, both for the men of Gondor and Rohan, who had died defending the city, and even for the enemies who had fallen there, because death deserved dignity regardless of which banner one had followed. These cairns dotted the fields like small hills, planted with grass and wildflowers, and people would come to lay tokens at those that held their loved ones. But the fields were too fertile and too necessary to leave as only memorial. The living needed food, and honoring the dead meant continuing to live well. So farmers returned to plow and plant, and within a few years, wheat and barley grew golden under the sun. Orchards produced apples and pears, and the sound of scythes at harvest replaced the memory of clashing swords. The land healed by being used for life. The fellowship between Gondor and Rohan, already strong from shared battle, deepened into something that felt less like alliance and more like kinship. Éomer, who had become king of Rohan after Theoden fell at the Pelennor fields, visited Minas Tirith often, and Aragorn would travel to Edoras to walk the Golden Halls and ride across the plains with the Rohirrim. They established joint patrols along their borders, not to guard against each other but to watch together for any stirring of old evils or new troubles. Trade flowed freely between the kingdoms. Rohan's horses, the finest in Middle-earth, were prized in Gondor, while Gondorian crafts and southern goods found eager buyers in Edoras. When Éomer married Lothiriel, daughter of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, the wedding celebrated not just their union but the interweaving of their peoples. Their children would carry the legacy of both horse lords and sea princes, and through them, the bonds between the kingdoms became woven into blood and bone. impossible to break. The city of Osgiliath, which had been a ruin for so long that few remembered it as anything but broken stone and haunted shadows, began to be rebuilt under Aragorn's direction. It would never again be the capital it once was. That role belonged to Minas Tirith now, but it could serve as a crossing point and a center of trade on the great river. Engineers studied the ruins of the ancient bridge and began the painstaking work of reconstruction, placing massive stones with the help of pulleys and dwarvish engineering. The eastern bank, which had been abandoned to Mordor's forces for decades, was cleared of corruption and reclaimed. Buildings rose where rubble had been, and gradually, people willing to live on the frontier moved in, drawn by Aragorn's offers of land and opportunity. The river, which had run dark and troubled, began to clear, and fish returned to waters that had known only rot. On quiet evenings, the sound of water flowing under the rebuilt bridge mixed with voices from taverns and homes, life asserting itself over the memory of death. Ithilien, the fair land east of the great river that had been ravaged by war and used as a staging ground by Mordor's forces, was given to Faramir as his princedom. Aragorn named him Prince of Ithilien, and Faramir accepted the responsibility with humility and determination. The land was beautiful still, beneath the scars, forests of birch and oak, streams running clear over smooth stones, glades where sunlight fell in golden shafts. But it was also damaged, marked by the passage of armies, some areas poisoned by dark sorceries that would take years to cleanse. Faramir brought settlers from Gondor, people willing to work hard to restore the land in exchange for the chance to build new lives. He walked among them as Aragorn walked among the people of Minas Tirith, without heirs, helping to clear fields and plant orchards. Slowly, season by season, Ithilien began to heal. Gardens appeared, then farms, then small villages. The forest, left to grow wild in protected areas, began to thrive again, and deer that had fled during the war returned, picking their way carefully through the underbrush, reclaiming their ancient home. Éowyn, who had slain the Witch King but had been gravely wounded in body and spirit, found her healing not just in the houses of healing, but in Faramir's company. They had met while both were recovering from their wounds, and in each other they recognized a shared understanding. Both had known the desire for glory in battle. Both had faced death directly. Both had learned that true courage sometimes meant choosing life and quietness over the sharpness of the sword. When they married, Éowyn became Princess of Ithilien, and she threw herself into the work of restoration with the same fierce determination she had once brought to war. She learned the names of healing herbs, the cycles of planting and harvest, the patience required to nurture growing things. She would walk through the forest with Faramir, and he would point out birds and plants, teaching her the lore of the wild, while she taught him the songs of Rohan, the stories of her people. Together, they built something neither could have created alone: a home, a purpose, a peace that went deeper than the absence of war. The caves of Aglarond, the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, became a wonder of the age under Gimli's care. During the War of the Ring, when Gimli had sheltered there during the battle, he had seen their beauty even in the midst of danger. Columns of stone like frozen waterfalls, crystals that caught torchlight and scattered it into rainbows, chambers that echoed with the sound of underground streams. After the war, he brought a company of dwarves from Erebor and began work to transform the caves into a place of such beauty that it would be remembered for ages. They carved halls, with a delicacy that seemed impossible for hands used to war axes, creating spaces that enhanced the natural beauty rather than dominating it. Light wells were cut to bring in the sun, and the interplay of light and shadow on the stone made the caves seem alive, breathing. Gimli invited Legolas to see the finished work, and the elf who had promised to visit the caves in exchange for Gimli visiting Fangorn Forest walked through them in wonder, admitting that here was beauty that even the forests could not surpass. The two friends stood together in the deepest chamber, where the silence was so complete it felt holy, and neither spoke, because no words could add to what they felt. Legolas brought a company of elves from Mirkwood to settle in Ithilien, creating a small elvish colony in the forests that Faramir protected. They built their homes high in the ancient trees, platforms and walkways that seemed to grow from the branches themselves, and at night, soft lights would glow in the canopy like earthbound stars. The elves helped cleanse areas of Ithilien that had been corrupted by Mordor's presence, singing songs that eased the pain in the land, planting trees that grew with unusual speed, their roots breaking up tainted soil and drawing out poison. Under elvish care, combined with the hard work of Faramir's settlers, Ithilien began to flourish beyond even its former beauty. The elves taught the men and women who lived there the lore of growing things, the language of birds, the signs of the seasons written in bark and leaf. In return, they learned from mortals the value of change, the poignancy of things that bloom and fade, the courage it takes to build knowing that time will eventually wear all works away. It was a brief meeting of cultures, for the elves would not stay forever, but while it lasted, it was something precious. The realm of Lothlorien, where Galadriel and Celeborn had ruled for an age of the world, began its slow decline after the War of the Ring. With the One Ring destroyed, the power of Nenya, Galadriel's ring, faded, and the enchantment that had held Lothlorien outside the normal flow of time weakened. The golden leaves of the Malern trees still sang in the wind, and the forest remained beautiful beyond the measure of mortal lands. But Galadriel knew that her time in Middle-earth was ending. She prepared to sail west to Valinor, to the undying lands from which she had been exiled for so long. The elves of Lothlorien began to feel the call of the sea, a longing that grew in their hearts like homesickness for a place they had never seen. Some left with Galadriel when she finally departed, traveling to the Grey Havens and boarding the white ships that would carry them beyond the circles of the world. Others lingered, unwilling to leave while Celeborn remained, and the forest echoed with songs that were sweet and sorrowful in equal measure. Hymns of goodbye sung to trees and streams that had been their companions for centuries. Rivendell, the last homely house, began to empty as well, though more slowly than Lothlorien. Elrond had departed with the ring-bearers, sailing west shortly after the destruction of the One Ring, and without his presence, the valley felt different, as though some essential light had dimmed. His sons, Aladan and Elrohir, remained for a time, unwilling to leave Middle-earth while their work against the remnants of evil was unfinished. But eventually, they too heard the call of the sea and made their way to the Grey Havens. The great house stood quiet, its libraries still full of ancient books, its gardens still tended by those elves who chose to linger. But the halls that had once rung with song and laughter grew silent. Travelers who had once found welcome and rest there would arrive to find fewer lights in the windows, fewer voices offering greeting. The waterfall still sang its endless song, and the valley remained fair, but it felt like a beautiful memory rather than a living place, like something preserved in amber, waiting for the final moment when the last elf would depart and leave it to the woods and the wandering deer. Celeborn, who had ruled Lothlorien alongside Galadriel for thousands of years, remained in Middle-earth even after his wife departed. He could not bring himself to leave, not yet, though the longing for the West grew in him like an ache. He dwelt for a time in Rivendell, walking the paths where Elrond had walked, sitting in the Hall of Fire where so many councils had been held. He was the last of the great elven lords of the elder days still remaining in Middle-earth, and he carried memories that stretched back to times before the sun and moon, to the light of the two trees in Valinor, to the first awakening of the elves under stars. His presence was like an anchor to the deep past, and those who met him felt they were speaking with living history. But he was also lonely in a way that mortals could scarcely understand, separated from his wife, from his people, from everything he had known. Eventually, he would sail west as well, but for long years he remained, the last keeper of lore that would otherwise be lost, teaching those willing to learn about the world as it had been before the shadow fell. The Grey Havens, where the elves departed Middle-earth, saw an endless procession of ships during the early Fourth Age. Círdan the shipwright, oldest of the elves remaining in Middle-earth, built vessel after vessel, each one crafted with love and sorrow, each one designed to carry his people beyond the sight of mortal lands. The ships were beautiful, made of white wood that seemed to glow in moonlight, with sails that caught wind like captured clouds. Elves would come from all corners of Middle-earth, from Mirkwood and Lothlorien, from Rivendell and the scattered woods of Eriador, making their final journey to the coast. They would stand on the shore, looking back at the lands they had loved and protected for ages, and then they would board the ships, taking nothing with them but memories. The ships would sail west into the sunset, and those watching from shore would see them grow smaller and smaller until they vanished into light, passing into realms where mortal feet could not follow. Each departure diminished Middle-earth, removed a thread of magic from its weaving, and the world became a little more ordinary, a little more the domain of men. Sam Gamgee returned to the Shire after the quest, and though he had traveled farther and seen more wonders than any hobbit in living memory, his heart belonged to the simple comforts of home. He moved back into Bag End at Frodo's invitation, and he married Rose Cotton, whom he had loved since before the world had called him to adventure. Their wedding was held in the party field, with all the Shire invited, and the celebration lasted 3 days, full of dancing and singing, and enough food to satisfy even the most demanding hobbit appetite. Sam and Rose made a home together in Bag End, filling the rooms where Bilbo and Frodo had lived with the laughter of children. They would eventually have 13, each one loved and raised with the same steady kindness Sam had learned from his gaffer. He planted gardens that became famous throughout the Shire, growing vegetables of extraordinary size and flavor, flowers that bloomed in colors that seemed touched by elvish magic. When people asked his secret, he would simply smile and say he'd learned from the best, and those who knew understood he meant both Gandalf and the Lady Galadriel. The Malern tree that Sam planted in the party field, grown from a seed gifted by Galadriel, became one of the wonders of the Shire. It grew impossibly fast, reaching heights that dwarfed any tree the hobbits had seen before, and its bark shone silver while its leaves turned golden in autumn, holding their color late into winter before finally falling. The tree became a gathering place, a landmark visible from miles away, and hobbits would come from all corners of the Shire just to sit in its shade and feel the strange peace that seemed to radiate from it. Children played around its massive roots. Lovers carved their initials into its bark, and on summer evenings, the entire party field would fill with hobbits who came to picnic and talk and watch the sun set through golden leaves. Birds nested in its branches, unusual birds with bright plumage and sweet songs, and sometimes on very quiet nights, those with keen ears claimed they could hear the tree itself singing, a sound like wind and water and very old memory woven together. Sam served 7 terms as mayor of the Shire, elected again and again because the hobbits recognized in him a rare combination of common sense, genuine care for others, and the wisdom that came from having seen the wider world. He refused the 8th term, saying there were younger folk who deserved their chance, though the truth was he wanted more time for his garden and his family. As mayor, he oversaw the replanting of the trees that Saruman's ruffians had cut down during the scouring of the Shire, ensuring that every lost tree was replaced with a better one. He used the earth from Galadriel's box, sprinkling it sparingly across the Shire, and everywhere it touched, things grew with unusual vigor and beauty. He also worked to preserve the memory of the quest, commissioning a great book where the story would be written down for future generations, because he understood that stories were how hobbits made sense of the world, and this story was too important to let fade into confused legend. He asked Frodo to write it, and later, when Frodo could no longer bear the weight of memory, Sam took over the task himself, writing in careful script about roads that went ever on and on. Merry and Pippin returned to the Shire as well, but they were changed in ways that went beyond the obvious physical changes. They were taller than other hobbits, having drunk the Enti draughts in Fangorn Forest, and they carried themselves with a confidence and worldliness that made other hobbits regard them with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Merry became Master of Buckland, inheriting the position from his father, and he proved to be an excellent leader, combining traditional hobbit practicality with insights gained from riding with the Rohirrim and sitting in councils with kings. Pippin became Thine of the Shire, the ceremonial head of all hobbits, and he took the role seriously, working to strengthen the Shire's defenses, not with walls or weapons, which hobbits instinctively disliked, but with networks of communication and mutual aid that ensured no corner of the Shire would face trouble alone. Both of them maintained connections with the outside world, corresponding with Aragorn and traveling occasionally to Gondor or Rohan, serving as bridges between the insular hobbit culture and the wider events of the age. The scouring of the Shire, when Saruman had briefly taken control and industrialized parts of the peaceful land, left scars that took time to heal. Sam led the restoration efforts, but it was a communal work. Hobbits from every corner of the Shire came together to tear down the ugly buildings Saruman's men had erected, to fill in the pits they had dug, to plant new trees and gardens in places that had been despoiled. The old mill, which had been replaced with a loud, smoking factory, was torn down completely and rebuilt in the traditional style, powered by the water wheel as it had been for generations. Houses that had been damaged were repaired with care, restored to their comfortable roundness, their gardens replanted with roses and snapdragons and the vegetables that hobbits preferred. Slowly, the Shire returned to its former character, and within a few years, a visitor would hardly know that anything untoward had happened, except that the hobbits were perhaps a bit more vigilant, a bit less willing to ignore news from outside their borders, having learned that isolation was not always protection. Frodo struggled more than the others to find peace in the Shire after the quest. The wound he had received from the Morgul blade never fully healed, and on the anniversary of receiving it, and on other dark days, he would feel pain that no herb or medicine could ease. The burden of having carried the ring left marks on his spirit as well. He would sometimes wake from nightmares, gasping, his hand reaching for something that was no longer there. He tried to settle into the life of the Shire, helping Sam with the great book, tending to small tasks. But there was a sadness in him that other hobbits could sense even if they didn't understand it. He loved the Shire, loved every green hill and flowering tree, but he experienced it now as something distant, as though he were separated from it by glass, able to see but not fully touch. On good days, he could smile and joke with Sam and the others, could enjoy a pipe on the step of Bag End, could feel almost like himself. On bad days, he was somewhere else entirely, walking roads in memory that no one else could see, carrying weights no one else could feel. Bilbo Baggy lived in Rivendell after leaving the Shire, and he spent his final years in as much comfort and contentment as an old hobbit could wish. He continued working on his book, translating elvish poetry, recording the songs and stories he had collected over his long life. He would sit in the Hall of Fire in the evenings, listening to the elves sing, occasionally joining in when they performed pieces he knew. His memory began to fade in his last years. Sometimes he would forget where he was, would call for Gandalf or ask when they were leaving for the Lonely Mountain, living partly in the present and partly in memories of adventures long past. But he was never frightened or distressed, and the elves cared for him with gentle patience, honoring him as one who had played his part in the great stories of the age. He passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 131, the oldest hobbit in recorded history, and his last words were about roads and adventures, about the desire to see mountains again, to hear dragons and watch the sun rise over lands he'd never walked. The elves buried him with honor on a hill overlooking the valley, planting flowers that bloomed even in winter over his resting place. The departure of the ring-bearers was perhaps the most bittersweet moment in all the early Fourth Age. Frodo, who could find no peace in Middle-earth despite his love for it, was granted permission to sail west with the elves, a rare gift given in recognition of the burden he had carried. Gandalf, whose work in Middle-earth was finally complete, sailed as well, along with Elrond and Galadriel. They departed from the Grey Havens on a quiet autumn evening, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple. Sam, Merry, and Pippin came to see Frodo off, and the goodbye was harder than any battle they had faced together. Frodo embraced each of them, and to Sam he gave the Red Book, asking him to continue the story, to remember. The ship pulled away from the dock, white sails filling with a wind that came from beyond the world, and Sam stood watching until it disappeared into the sunset, tears streaming down his face, his hand raised in farewell to a friend he would not see again until his own journey was finished, many years hence. Sam's family became one of the most beloved in the Shire, known not for wealth or status but for warmth and kindness that seemed to radiate from their very doorstep. Rose was a perfect match for Sam, practical and loving, with a laugh that could brighten the darkest day and a way of making everyone who entered Bag End feel welcomed and fed. Their children grew up hearing stories of far lands and great deeds, but also learning the value of a well-tended garden, a kind word to a neighbor, and the courage it took to do small good things consistently. The eldest daughter, Eleanor, inherited Sam's love of elven lore and would often ask him to tell her about the Lady Galadriel, about the light of Arendil's star, about the malern trees in Lothlorien that made the one in the party field seem like a small cousin. Sam would tell her these stories while they worked in the garden together, his weathered hands teaching her small hands how to coax life from soil, how to prune and water, and wait with patience for good things to grow. The younger children of Sam and Rose filled Bag End with exactly the kind of chaos and joy that Bilbo and Frodo would have loved to witness. There were always toys scattered across the floor, always sticky hands reaching for second helpings at meals, always someone crying or laughing or both at once. Sam would sometimes pause in the midst of the beautiful mayhem, watching his children play, and feel a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what the quest had been for, he would think. Not for glory or songs to be written, but for the right of ordinary folk to live ordinary lives, to raise families in safety, to worry about nothing more serious than whether the carrots needed watering or whether there would be enough seed cake for elevenses. He had walked through Mordor so that his children would never have to, had faced darkness so that they could grow up in light. And on those quiet moments of reflection, he knew with absolute certainty that every step of that terrible journey had been worth it. Mary married Estella Bolger, and they made their home in Brandy Hall in Buckland, where the sound of the Brandywine River was a constant companion. Mary brought to his role as Master of Buckland the strategic thinking he had learned from Theoden and the Rohirrim, but tempered it with Hobbit practicality and a genuine love for his people. He organized the Shire's defenses in subtle ways, not armies or weapons, but networks of messengers who could spread word quickly if trouble arose, agreements between different regions to aid each other, and a quiet understanding with the rangers of the north that they would keep watch on the Shire's borders. He also maintained the tradition of scholarship that Buckland had always valued, expanding the library at Brandy Hall and encouraging young hobbits to learn their letters and numbers, to study history and geography, to understand that the world was larger and more complex than the borders of the Shire. On summer evenings, he would sit with Pippin and smoke their pipes, talking about old times. And sometimes they would burst into Rohirric, drinking songs that scandalized older hobbits and delighted the younger ones. Pippin married Diamond of Long Cleave, and they had a son named Faramir, named after the Prince of Ithilien, whom Pippin had served in Gondor and come to love as a friend and mentor. Young Faramir grew up hearing stories about his namesake, about the White City and the Houses of Healing, about the courage it took to choose mercy over vengeance, wisdom over rash action. Pippin proved to be an energetic and beloved Thine, throwing himself into the role with the same enthusiasm he had shown for everything else in his life. He improved roads throughout the Shire, established better postal service, and created a system of public wells and grain stores that ensured no hobbit would go hungry even in difficult years. He traveled more than most Tynes, visiting every corner of his domain, and he had a gift for remembering names and faces that made even the most isolated hobbit feel seen and valued. His tenure as Thine became known as a time of prosperity and good fellowship, when the Shire felt truly united, rather than merely a collection of separate regions that happened to share borders. The friendship between Legolas and Gimli, which had begun in unlikely circumstances and grown through shared trials, became legendary in the Fourth Age. After the war, they traveled Middle-earth together, each showing the other the wonders of their respective peoples. Gimli brought Legolas deep into the glittering caves, fulfilling his promise, and watched with satisfaction as the elf stood speechless before the beauty of shaped stone and natural crystal. Legolas, in turn, brought Gimli into Fangorn Forest, where the dwarf walked among the ancient trees with considerably more respect than he had shown forests in earlier days, having learned that growing things had their own kind of strength and beauty. They visited Rivendell together, the Lonely Mountain, the Iron Hills, traveling as companions who needed no words to understand each other, whose friendship had become so deep that differences of culture and history seemed irrelevant compared to the bond they shared. Other dwarves and elves, seeing them together, began to reconsider ancient prejudices, thinking that if these two could find friendship, perhaps old enmities were worth setting aside. Gimli eventually settled in the glittering caves permanently, bringing a colony of dwarves from Erebor to establish a new stronghold. They worked the caves with reverence, enhancing natural beauty rather than simply extracting wealth, creating halls that would have made even elvish craftsmen pause in appreciation. Gimli oversaw every detail personally, ensuring that the work honored both dwarvish craftsmanship and the inherent wonder of the caves themselves. He established trade with Rohan, providing metalwork and stonecraft in exchange for the goods that the plains produced, and the relationship between dwarves and the horse lords became strong and mutually beneficial. Gimli also maintained his promise to Galadriel, keeping her memory alive in his heart and speaking of her with such reverence that those who heard him began to understand that she must have been something truly extraordinary. He set 3 strands of her golden hair in a crystal, treasuring them more than all the mithril and gems in his halls, and sometimes he would take out the crystal and look at them, remembering starlight in Lothlorien, remembering grace and wisdom and beauty that had changed him forever. Legolas brought elves from Mirkwood to dwell in Ithilien, creating a small colony in the forests that Faramir protected as prince. The elves built their homes in the trees, platforms and dwellings that seemed to grow from the branches, connected by bridges that swayed gently in the breeze. At night, soft lights would glow in the canopy, not fire, but the captured light of stars, or so it seemed to mortal eyes watching from below. The elves sang as they worked, and their songs seemed to sink into the soil, encouraging growth, easing the lingering taint that Mordor had left on the land. Trees that the elves planted grew with unusual speed and health, their leaves staying green longer into autumn, their roots breaking up corrupted earth and drawing out poison. The settlers of Ithilien learned to recognize elvish music drifting through the forest, and they came to see it as a blessing, a sign that the land was truly healing. The elves, for their part, found something precious in their time among mortals, a reminder of why Middle-earth was worth loving, why the Valar had made the world to begin with, why even fleeting beauty mattered. The forests of Ithilien became a place where mortal and elf lived in closer harmony than anywhere else in Middle-earth during the Fourth Age. Human children would sometimes catch glimpses of elvish children playing in the high branches, moving with impossible grace, and occasionally the young of both races would meet and share games, though the mortal children always tired first, and the elvish children never quite understood why their friends couldn't climb as high or see as far. The elves taught mortals the names of plants in the ancient tongue, the patterns of stars, the art of moving through forest without disturbing the life around them. Mortals taught elves songs that changed from generation to generation, showed them the poignancy of things that bloomed and faded quickly. demonstrated the determination it took to build and plant and love, knowing that time would eventually claim everything. It was an exchange that enriched both peoples, and though it could not last forever, the elves would eventually feel the call of the sea and depart. While it existed, it was a glimpse of what Middle-earth had been in earlier ages, when the children of Ilúvatar walked together in greater understanding. Éomer ruled Rohan for 65 years, and his reign became known as a golden age for the Horse Lords. He strengthened Edoras, expanded the city, and improved its defenses, but more importantly, he ensured that the alliance with Gondor remained unshakable. He married Lothiriel, daughter of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, and their marriage united the plains and the sea, the horses of Rohan and the ships of the coast. Their children learned to ride almost before they could walk, but they also learned the lore of the sea, the navigation by stars, the songs of both their parents' peoples. Éomer maintained the tradition of the riders, the elite cavalry that had saved Gondor at the Pelennor Fields, ensuring they remained the finest horsemen in all of Middle-earth. But he also worked to build prosperity in times of peace, improving roads, establishing trade routes, creating alliances with neighboring peoples. Under his rule, Rohan ceased to be merely a kingdom of warriors and became a land of culture and learning as well, though always the horses remained central to their identity, always the wide plains called to their hearts. The great Mearas, the noble horses that had served as mounts for kings and carried Gandalf and the Rohirrim into legend, continued their line through the Fourth Age. Shadowfax, the greatest of them all, had borne Gandalf through many perils, and though he departed Middle-earth with the wizard, his descendants carried his nobility and speed. These horses were never bought or sold, never broken to bridle against their will, but chose their riders in a bond that went deeper than mastery or servitude. They could understand speech, or so the Rohirrim believed, and they seemed to sense danger before mortal senses could detect it. To ride a Mearas was considered one of the highest honors in Rohan, a sign that one had been judged worthy not just by human standards, but by the wisdom of the horses themselves. They ranged across the plains like living wind, silver and gray under moonlight, and watching them run was like seeing poetry in motion, grace and power combined in a way that reminded all who witnessed it that Middle-earth still held wonders, even as the age of magic slowly faded. The Golden Hall of Edoras was restored and expanded under Éomer's reign, the damages from Saruman's corruption repaired and improved upon. The great pillars were recarved with images of horses and heroes, the thatch roof replaced with fresh golden straw that gleamed in sunlight, and the interior filled with tapestries depicting the great deeds of the Rohirrim through the ages. A special place of honor was given to the memory of Theoden, with a tapestry showing him riding to war at the Pelennor Fields, his final charge immortalized in golden thread and careful needlework. The hall became a center not just of governance but of culture. Poets and singers would come to perform, and the best were given places of honor, their songs added to the tradition of the mark. On winter nights, when snow lay deep outside, the hall would be warm and bright, full of voices raised in song and story, and old warriors would teach young ones the history of their people, ensuring that memory of sacrifice and courage would not fade, even as the years of peace stretched on. Faramir and Éowyn had children who grew up in Ithilien, raised among both the stone buildings their father built and the forest where elvish lights glowed in the branches. Their son, Elberon, eventually became Prince of Ithilien after Faramir, continuing the work of restoration and stewardship, maintaining the friendship with the elves for as long as they remained in Middle-earth. The children learned swordplay from their mother, who never lost the skill that had allowed her to slay the Witch King, though she taught them that the blade was a last resort, to be drawn only when all other options had failed. They learned diplomacy and herb lore from their father, walking with him through the forests, learning to identify plants by leaf and scent, understanding that governing meant caring for both people and land. They grew up visiting both Minas Tirith and Edoras, comfortable in both the White City and the Golden Hall, embodying in their very persons the union of Gondor and Rohan that their parents' marriage represented. The land of Mordor itself, once the very heart of darkness, began a slow and painful process of healing after Sauron's final defeat. The Dark Tower of Barad-dûr collapsed utterly when the ring was destroyed, its foundations shattered, its stones scattered across the plain of Gorgoroth like broken teeth. The land remained desolate for many years, ash-covered, scarred by volcanic eruptions, poisoned by the long presence of evil. No grass grew there, no birds sang, and the very air tasted of metal and despair. Yet even in Mordor, time worked its patient magic. Rain fell, washing away layers of ash. Wind carried seeds from distant lands. The mountains of shadow and the ash mountains still ringed the land like prison walls. But within those walls, the earth itself began the work of renewal. It would take centuries, perhaps millennia, but nothing in nature remains static forever. The slow healing had begun, though whether Mordor would ever again be a fair land, none could say. Gondor maintained vigilant watch over Mordor's borders throughout the Fourth Age, unwilling to let those dark lands become a refuge for evil again. Aragorn established fortresses along the mountains, manned by rotating companies of soldiers who kept watch on the passes and reported any stirring of darkness. These were lonely posts where men served far from comfort or companionship, staring out at lifeless plains under gray skies, but they accepted the duty because they understood its necessity. The watchers reported that sometimes, on very dark nights, strange lights could be seen in the ruins, and distant sounds like the echo of hammer on anvil, or the scrape of something massive moving through stone. Whether these were genuine dangers or simply the land's memory of what had been, none could say with certainty. But the watch was maintained generation after generation, ensuring that if evil ever did stir again in that cursed place, it would not go unnoticed until it had grown strong. Minas Morgul, the tower of sorcery that had been Minas Ithil before its corruption, remained a place of dread even after Sauron's fall. The Nazgûl who had dwelt there were gone, destroyed when the ring was unmade, but the tower itself still stood, white stone turned, sickly pale, radiating a sense of wrongness that made even the bravest soldiers reluctant to approach. Faramir, as Prince of Ithilien, decreed that the bridge leading to the tower should be broken and the valley avoided. No one lived in the vale where Minas Morgul stood, and travelers were warned to take other routes, even if they added days to their journey. Over time, vegetation began to reclaim the area around the tower, but it grew twisted and strange. Thorns that seemed sharper than natural, flowers with scents that made people nauseous, trees that grew in shapes that hurt to look at. The corruption would take many lifetimes to fade, if it ever did completely, and Minas Morgul stood as a reminder that some wounds cut so deep they might never fully heal. Some places held darkness so long it became part of their very nature. The paths of the dead, through which Aragorn had led the Grey Company to summon the Oathbreakers, became quiet after the spirits fulfilled their pledge and found peace. The mountain passages that had been haunted for thousands of years, where fear had accumulated like layers of sediment, slowly became ordinary caves again. The sense of dread that had made even the bravest avoid those paths began to dissipate, and eventually, travelers could pass through without feeling the crushing weight of ancient despair. Aragorn had freed the dead from their curse by allowing them to fulfill their broken oath, and in doing so, he had cleansed a wound in the world that had festered since the days of Isildur. The people of the White Mountains, who had lived in the shadow of that curse for generations, felt as though a burden they hadn't fully understood had been lifted. Children could play in the foothills without their parents calling them back in fear. The mountains themselves seemed lighter, as though the stone had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The eagles of the Misty Mountains, who had aided the free peoples in their darkest hour, returned to their eyries after the war and were seen less frequently as the years of peace continued. Gwaihir, the Wind Lord, who had rescued Gandalf more than once and had borne Frodo and Sam from the slopes of Mount Doom when all seemed lost, lived on in his high places, watching the world from vantage points where clouds formed below and the air was thin and cold. The eagles remained free and noble, beholden to no master, but they remembered the fellowship they had shared with those who fought against darkness, and occasionally, travelers in the mountains would see massive shadows pass overhead, wingtips scraping the sky, and they would know the eagles still kept watch. The legend of the great eagles became part of the lore told to children, stories of rescue and hope arriving on wings when all seemed lost, and though the eagles themselves cared little for fame, their deeds were not forgotten. Treebeard and the Ents of Fangorn Forest continued their slow existence, shepherding the ancient woods, though they grew fewer with each passing age. No new Entings had been born in many lifetimes. The Entwives, who had known the secrets of agriculture and growing things in gardens, had been lost long ago, and without them, the Ents could not reproduce. Treebeard, oldest of the living Ents, walked his forest paths with patient sorrow, remembering times when the woods had been wider and the Ents more numerous, when the world had been younger and full of growing things. He tended the Huorns, the trees that had become half aware, protecting them from axes and fire, ensuring that Fangorn remained a refuge for the old ways. The Ents spoke less and less to the outside world, withdrawing into their timeless vigil. But sometimes a traveler brave enough to enter the deep forest would hear slow voices like the creaking of ancient timber, discussing matters that mortals could barely comprehend, using words that took hours to speak and contained meanings layered like tree rings. The Shire prospered under the leadership of Sam, Merry, and Pippin, becoming a model of how a society could flourish in peacetime. The hobbits had learned from their brush with Saruman's industrialization, and they consciously chose to preserve their traditional ways, rather than pursuing the kind of progress that destroyed beauty in the name of efficiency. Watermills remained water-powered, farms remained small and family-run, and the pace of life stayed blessedly slow. But this wasn't mere conservatism or fear of change. It was a deliberate choice to value quality of life over quantity of production, to preserve community bonds over individual wealth, to keep their hills green and their rivers clear because those things mattered more than profit. Other lands might build factories and chase efficiency, but the Shire chose happiness instead, and visiting it was like stepping into a gentler time, where the most important matters of the day were whether the mushrooms were good this year and whether there would be fireworks at the next party. The Red Book of Westmarch, which contained the history of the ring and the quest to destroy it, became one of the most precious documents in Middle-earth. Sam had taken over its writing from Frodo, adding his own accounts and memories, and he guarded it carefully, understanding that future generations would need to know what had happened, what had been risked and sacrificed to preserve their freedom. The book contained Bilbo's account of his adventure to the Lonely Mountain, Frodo's narrative of the War of the Ring, and Sam's additions and elaborations. Copies were eventually made and sent to Minas Tirith and other centers of learning, but the original remained in the Shire, passed down through Sam's family. Eleanor, Sam's eldest daughter, became its keeper after her father, and she treated it with the reverence it deserved, understanding that she held in her hands not just a book, but a memory of courage, a record of how even the smallest people could change the fate of the world if they refused to surrender to despair. Aragorn's later years were marked by the same wisdom and care that had characterized his entire reign. He never became distant or unapproachable as some kings did, never lost touch with the common people whose lives formed the foundation of his kingdom. Even in old age, when his hair had turned silver and his face had become lined with the weight of years and responsibility, he would walk the streets of Minas Tirith, speaking with shopkeepers and craftsmen, listening to their concerns, remembering names and families. He had been blessed with the long life of Númenórean ancestry, and he used every year of it in service to his people, building alliances, settling disputes, ensuring that the peace won with such difficulty would not be squandered through negligence or pride. He wrote laws that protected the vulnerable, established schools where knowledge could be preserved and shared, and created a system of governance that would outlast him, ensuring his kingdom wouldn't collapse when he was gone. He was exactly what a king should be, a servant of his people rather than their master. Arwen walked beside Aragorn through all the years of his reign, and though she aged more slowly than he did, having chosen mortality, she felt the passage of time in her heart. She had given up immortality for love, had chosen a mortal life and a mortal death over the endless years in Valinor, and she never regretted the choice, though it came with its own form of grief. She watched Aragorn's hair turn gray, saw the lines deepen in his face, knew that every passing year brought them closer to the separation that mortality demanded. But she also knew joy deeper than what she might have found in the undying lands. The joy of children and grandchildren, the satisfaction of building something with her husband, the profound beauty of seasons changing and years passing and moments that mattered precisely because they would not last forever. She learned what all mortals know, that love is sweeter because it is temporary, that beauty shines brighter because it fades, that every moment together becomes precious when you know the number of moments is limited. Aragorn chose the time of his passing, as was the right of the kings of Númenor in ancient days. In the year 120 of the Fourth Age, when he was 210 years old, he felt that his time had come. He was not ill or wounded. He simply knew, with the certainty that came from his heritage, that his work was done, and it was time to lay down the burden of mortality. He prepared carefully, ensuring that Eldarion was ready to take up the kingship, settling his affairs, saying farewell to old friends. He went to the House of the Kings in Rath Dainan, and there he lay down on the bed prepared for him. Arwen came to him, and they spoke together in private, words meant for no other ears, a final communion between two people who had shared their lives completely. Then Aragorn closed his eyes and released his hold on life. passing peacefully as the sun set over Minas Tirith, leaving Middle-earth to the next generation, having fulfilled every promise he had made. Arwen's grief was profound and private. After Aragorn's death, she left Minas Tirith and made her way to Lothlorien, to the land where she had lived before mortality called her to a different path. The forest was nearly empty now. Galadriel had long since sailed west, and most of the elves had followed. Only Celeborn remained, and even he was preparing to depart. Arwen walked among the golden trees where she had played as a child, where she had known certainty and timelessness, and she felt the weight of her choice settling around her like a cloak. She had chosen this, the pain of loss, the fading of strength, the approaching darkness that mortals called death. She had chosen it for love, and even in her grief she would not have chosen differently. She remained in Lothlorien through the changing seasons, and in the winter, on Seren Amroth, where she and Aragorn had pledged their troth, she lay down among the Elenor flowers and let go of life, following her beloved into the mystery that lies beyond the circles of the world. Legolas remained in Middle-earth for many years after Aragorn's death, continuing his work in Ithilien, tending the forests and maintaining his friendship with Gimli. But eventually, the call of the sea became too strong to resist. The longing that all elves eventually felt, the pull toward Valinor, grew in him until it was like a physical ache, and he knew his time in Middle-earth was ending. He built a ship in Ithilien, gray and beautiful, crafted with elvish skill, and he prepared to sail west from the Grey Havens. But before he left, he went to Gimli, his friend of so many years and so many adventures, and he asked the dwarf if he would come with him. It was an extraordinary request. Dwarves were not permitted in Valinor, had never sailed to the Undying Lands, were bound to Middle-earth in ways elves were not. But Gimli, who had once been granted 3 strands of hair from Galadriel herself, who had earned the respect and love of the Lady of Light, was different. He agreed without hesitation, unwilling to be parted from his friend, and together they sailed west, passing beyond the sight of mortal lands. The departure of Legolas and Gimli marked a significant moment in the history of Middle-earth, for Gimli became the first and only dwarf to sail to the Undying Lands. The Valar, moved by the friendship between elf and dwarf and by Galadriel's advocacy, permitted him to come, honoring the bond that had grown from ancient enmity into profound love. Their ship sailed into the sunset, white sails catching wind from beyond the world, and those who watched from the shore saw it grow smaller and smaller until it seemed to merge with the light itself and vanish. With their passing, another thread connecting Middle-earth to its ancient past was severed. The elves who remained grew fewer each year, the forests quieter, the old magic weaker. The world was becoming the domain of men, as the Valar had always intended, and though something beautiful was being lost, something new was being born. A world where mortals would chart their own course, free from the shadows of the past, but also free from its light. Sam lived longer than most hobbits, blessed with unusual vitality that came perhaps from the long quest or from the touch of elvish magic through the years. After Rose passed away, peaceful and content after a long life together, Sam felt his own longing for the West grow strong. He had been a ring-bearer, if only briefly, and that gave him the same right Frodo had been given, to sail to Valinor and find healing there. In the year 61 of the Fourth Age, when he was 102 years old, Sam gave the Red Book to Elenor, embraced his children and grandchildren, and made his way to the Grey Havens. There, Círdan the shipwright had prepared a ship, the last ship that would sail from Middle-earth carrying ring-bearers. Sam boarded alone, but he was not afraid. He was going to see Frodo again, his master and friend, and he was going to see the land Galadriel had spoken of, where the light was older and purer than anything in Middle-earth. The ship sailed west into the sunset, and with Sam's departure, the last of the Fellowship left mortal lands, their part in the world's story complete. The Fourth Age continued long after the departure of those who had fought in the War of the Ring, and it became known as the Age of Men, when the dominion of Middle-earth passed fully to mortal hands. The elves faded into legend, remembered in songs and stories but no longer walking openly in the world. The dwarves retreated to their mountains, their great works becoming memories, their numbers dwindling as the age of stonecraft gave way to the age of iron and steel. The hobbits remained in the Shire, mostly forgotten by the larger world, content in their obscurity, preserving their gentle ways while the kingdoms of men rose and fell around them. Gondor endured, ruled by the descendants of Aragorn and Arwen, maintaining the peace and prosperity that the returned king had established. The white tree bloomed in the court of the fountain for many generations, a living symbol that some promises once made could be kept across the centuries. The stories of the War of the Ring became legend, then myth, and eventually, many people doubted they had ever been true at all. The idea that small hobbits had carried the fate of the world, that a ranger had become king, that the Dark Lord had been overthrown by destroying a ring in fire seemed too simple, too much like a fairy tale to be history. But in the Shire, the Red Book was carefully preserved, and in Gondor, the archives held detailed records, and those who sought the truth could find it, could trace the lineages, could visit the places where great deeds had been done. The party tree still stood, grown enormous and beautiful, sheltering the field where hobbits gathered for celebrations. The white tree still bloomed in Minas Tirith. The mountains still bore the scars of ancient battles. The world remembered, even when people forgot, and the land itself was a testament to what had happened, to the sacrifices made, to the choice between darkness and light that had been decided in fire on the edge of destruction. The descendants of the Fellowship carried their ancestors' legacy in different ways. Some became leaders and heroes in their own right, facing the challenges of their age with the courage inherited from those who had gone before. Others lived quiet lives, farmers and craftsmen and parents, honoring the memory of the quest by building good lives in the peace it had won. All of them knew the stories, passed down through generations, and though the details might shift in the telling, the heart remained true, that ordinary people, faced with overwhelming darkness, had chosen to stand rather than flee, to hope rather than despair, to love rather than hate. That even when victory seemed impossible, they had continued putting one foot in front of the other, doing the next right thing, trusting that small goods accumulated into something larger. That friendship could transcend differences of race and culture. That mercy and compassion were not weakness, but the highest forms of strength. Middle-earth settled into its new age, a world of men where magic was rare and miracles were remembered rather than expected. Cities grew larger, trade routes expanded, knowledge accumulated in libraries and universities. The old wild places grew smaller as forests were cleared and fields planted, as roads cut through wilderness and bridges spanned rivers that had been boundaries. It was a loss in some ways. The world became more ordinary, less touched by wonder, and those who remembered the elder days or heard the stories mourned what was passing. But it was also a gain, for this was the world men were meant to build, a world where they stood on their own feet without leaning on the wisdom of elves or the craft of dwarves, where they made their own choices and lived with the consequences, where they learned slowly and painfully, but learned nonetheless. The gift of mortality that had seemed like a curse to some was revealed as exactly that. A gift, the freedom to change, to grow, to write new stories rather than endlessly repeating old ones. In the quiet places of Middle-earth, in the deep forests that remained and the high mountains where few ventured, the old magic lingered still. Travelers would sometimes report strange encounters, a light in the trees that vanished when approached, a song in a language no one spoke anymore, a sense of presence in places that seemed empty. Whether these were the last remnants of elvish enchantment slowly fading, or whether the land itself held memory and expressed it in ways mortals barely perceived, none could say with certainty. But the mystery remained, a reminder that the world was larger and stranger than it seemed, that not everything could be mapped or measured or explained, and perhaps that was as it should be. For a world without mystery would be a world without wonder, and wonder was what made life worth living, what made people lift their eyes from the daily grind and remember that once, long ago, great deeds had been done. Darkness had been defeated, and the smallest person had proven capable of changing the world. The age of men continued, year flowing into year, generation following generation, and the world turned under sun and moon and stars as it always had. The people of Middle-earth built and loved and mourned and celebrated, living their lives with the same mixture of joy and sorrow that mortals had always known. They told stories around fires in the evening, sang songs that preserved memory even as details faded, passed on to their children the values they had learned from their parents. They faced new challenges and made new mistakes, but they also created new beauty, new knowledge, new connections. And though those who had fought in the War of the Ring were long gone, though the Fellowship had passed beyond the circles of the world or into peaceful rest, their legacy endured in every person who chose hope over despair, every act of kindness freely given, every friendship that bridged ancient divides. The world they had saved continued turning, breathing, living, and that more than any monument or song was the truest measure of their victory. That life went on, that people could love and build and dream, that the long darkness had ended and morning had come at last, gentle and golden, carrying on the wind the scent of growing things and the promise of seasons yet to come. Você está absolutamente correto. Vou expandir o roteiro adicionando mais fatos e profundidade. Vou criar uma parte 6x6 adicional com aproximadamente 8.000 palavras de conteúdo novo. The reconstruction of the ancient kingdom of Arnor proved to be one of Aragorn's most ambitious projects, requiring not just stone and mortar, but a complete reimagining of what the northern kingdom could become. The old capital of Annúminas had lain in ruins for nearly 1,000 years, its walls crumbled, its towers fallen, its streets overgrown with forest. When Aragorn first walked those ruins with a company of rangers, they found deer sheltering in what had once been throne rooms, owls nesting in the remnants of libraries, and trees growing through the floors of houses where his ancestors had lived and loved and raised children. The work of restoration began slowly, with surveyors mapping the extent of the ruins, architects studying what remained to understand the original design, and historians consulting ancient texts to learn what Annúminas had been in its glory. Aragorn insisted that the new city honor the old, while also serving the needs of people living in the present, creating a place where memory and practicality could coexist. The Northern Kingdom had been fragmented for so long that many of its people had forgotten they were part of a larger whole, living in isolated villages and small settlements, calling themselves by local names rather than identifying as Arnorians. Aragorn spent months traveling through the north, visiting these scattered communities, speaking with elders and young people alike, explaining that the king had returned and that the kingdom could be whole again if they chose to be part of it. Some welcomed him immediately, recognizing in him the bearing and wisdom of the old Númenorian kings, while others were suspicious, having learned through hard experience that claims of authority usually meant new taxes and new demands. Aragorn won them over not through commands but through service, helping to rebuild a bridge here, mediating a dispute there, bringing news and supplies from other regions, demonstrating that his kingship meant protection and connection rather than exploitation. Slowly, village by village, the Northern Kingdom began to knit itself back together. The Rangers of the North, who had kept watch over the scattered remnants of Arnor for generations without recognition or reward, finally received the honor they had long deserved. These men had walked lonely paths, fighting enemies in secret, dying unknown and unremembered, preserving what they could of the kingdom that had once existed. Aragorn knew them as brothers, having lived as one of them for most of his life, and he ensured they were recognized as the true heroes they were. He established the Order of the Star, awarding membership to rangers who had served with distinction, and he gave them positions of responsibility in the restored kingdom, as advisors, as commanders of border garrels, as teachers who could pass on their knowledge of woodcraft and warfare to the next generation. Many rangers found it difficult to adjust from lives of wandering secrecy to lives of open recognition, but they accepted the change because they trusted Aragorn, because he was one of them, because he understood what they had sacrificed and would never ask them to be something they were not. The line of Isildur, which had seemed on the verge of extinction when Aragorn was the last known heir, flourished in the Fourth Age through his children and grandchildren. Eldarion proved to be a worthy successor, ruling with the same combination of strength and compassion that his father had shown, maintaining the alliances and policies that had brought peace to Middle-earth. Through Eldarion and his siblings, the blood of Númenor spread through many families, and though it grew diluted with each generation, traces of that ancient heritage persisted. A tendency toward longer life, a certain nobility of bearing, gray eyes that seemed to see farther than normal eyes could reach. The people of Gondor and Arnor took pride in their royal line, not because they worshipped authority, but because the kings of the Fourth Age demonstrated through their actions that leadership was service, that power existed to protect those who had none, that the highest throne came with the heaviest responsibilities. The province of Anorion, the fertile land that lay between Minas Tirith and Rohan, became one of the most prosperous regions in Gondor during Aragorn's reign. The fields that had been trampled during the war were restored and expanded. New irrigation systems were built to bring water from the Mering Stream, and farming communities flourished under the protection of the king. The soil was rich, dark, and deep, perfect for growing wheat and barley, and the harvests became so abundant that Gondor not only fed itself, but exported grain to neighboring lands. The farmers of Anorian developed a relationship with the soil that went beyond mere cultivation. They learned which fields needed to rest, which crops to rotate, how to work with the land rather than exhausting it. On summer mornings, the fields would stretch golden under the sun, and the sound of scythes cutting grain would mix with the songs the workers sang. Old songs from before the war, and new songs about peace and plenty, their voices carrying across the fields like prayers of thanksgiving. The Dol Amroth, the great city on the coast where Prince Imrahil ruled, maintained its unique culture as both part of Gondor and something distinctly its own. The people of Dol Amroth had elvish blood in their ancestry, descended from unions between men and elves in the Elder Days, and they kept alive traditions and knowledge that had faded elsewhere. Their ships were built with lines that echoed elvish craft, graceful and swift, cutting through water with minimal resistance. Their warriors trained in combat styles that emphasized precision and elegance over brute force. Their music incorporated elements of elvish melody, complex harmonies that seemed to shimmer in the air. Prince Imrahil, who had fought valiantly at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and had helped defend Minas Tirith during its darkest hour, ruled his coastal domain with wisdom and grace, maintaining the Swan Knights as an elite force and ensuring that Dol Amroth remained a center of culture and learning. The city's white towers rose from the headland, visible to ships far out at sea, a beacon of civilization on the edge of the wild ocean. The Bay of Belfalas, where Dol Amroth stood watch, became a vital center of trade and shipbuilding in the Fourth Age. The harbors were expanded to accommodate the increased traffic. Docks built from timber and stone, warehouses constructed to store goods arriving from distant lands or waiting to be loaded for export. Ships from the south brought spices and silk, exotic woods and precious stones, while Gondorian ships carried metalwork and grain, wine and wool, the products of peace and prosperity. The shipwrights of Dol Amroth became famous for their craft, building vessels that could withstand the worst storms the sea could offer, and captains from many lands sought ships built in their yards. On clear days, the bay would be filled with sails, white and red and gold, catching the wind, the sound of ropes creaking and canvas snapping, mixing with the cries of gulls and the shouts of sailors. The smell of salt and tar and fish pervaded the docks, and the city thrummed with the constant motion of a place connected to the wider world. The forests of Anwar, in the southern regions of Gondor, were carefully managed under Aragorn's policies to balance the need for timber with the importance of preserving wild spaces. Foresters were trained in selective cutting, taking only mature trees and leaving the young to grow, ensuring the forest would regenerate rather than being stripped bare. They learned to identify which trees were diseased or damaged and needed to be removed for the health of the forest, and which should be left standing even if they were gnarled or twisted, because they provided homes for birds and squirrels and the countless small creatures that made the woodland their domain. Paths were cut through the forest for travelers, but wide swaths were left untouched. Refuges where deer could raise their fawns in safety, where wolves could hunt without encountering humans, where the forest could simply be itself without management or interference. The policy required patience and restraint, resisting the temptation to maximize immediate profit in favor of long-term sustainability. But it worked, and the forests remained healthy and productive for generations. The University of Minas Tirith, established in the early years of Aragorn's reign, became one of the great centers of learning in Middle-earth, drawing scholars from every corner of the known world. The university occupied several levels of the city, from libraries in the sixth circle to laboratories and workshops in the lower levels, where experiments could be conducted without disturbing the peace of the upper city. Students came to study history and languages, mathematics and natural philosophy, healing arts and astronomy. The faculty included both mortals and the few elves who remained in Middle-earth long enough to teach, creating a unique environment where different perspectives and bodies of knowledge could interact and enrich each other. Debates would rage in the courtyards about the nature of the world, the meaning of ancient texts, the best methods for measuring the movements of stars. Young minds were sharpened against older wisdom, and occasionally breakthroughs occurred. New understanding of old principles, new applications of established knowledge, innovations that improved lives in practical ways. The healing arts advanced significantly during the Fourth Age, building on the foundation Aragorn had laid with his knowledge of appendices and other herb lore. The houses of healing became centers of research as well as treatment, where healers studied the properties of plants, experimented with different preparations and dosages, kept careful records of what worked and what didn't. They learned to set broken bones with greater precision, to stitch wounds in ways that minimized scarring, to recognize the signs of diseases early when treatment was most effective. They also learned, through observation and experience, that healing involved more than treating physical injuries, that fear and despair could slow recovery, that hope and companionship could speed it, that sometimes the best medicine was simply sitting with someone in their pain and acknowledging it without trying to immediately fix it. The healers developed a holistic approach that treated the whole person rather than just the injury or illness, and their success rate improved dramatically as a result. The Festival of the King's Return, celebrated annually on the anniversary of Aragorn's coronation, became one of the most important holidays in Gondor, a day when the entire kingdom paused to remember what had been won and what it had cost. The celebration began at dawn with the ringing of bells throughout Minas Tirith, each level of the city adding its voice to the chorus until the air vibrated with sound. People gathered in the court of the fountain, where the king would speak, reminding them of the sacrifices made by those who had fallen, honoring the memory of Boromir and Theoden, and all the unnamed soldiers who had given their lives for the freedom of others. Then the tone would shift to celebration. Feasts spread through every level of the city, tables laden with food and drink, music playing in the squares, children running through the streets with ribbons and flowers. Veterans of the war would be honored, stories would be told, and as the sun set, fireworks would light the sky above the white city, colors blooming and fading like flowers made of light, while people watched and remembered and gave thanks. The language of Westron, which had been the common tongue of Middle-earth during the Third Age, continued to evolve in the Fourth Age, incorporating words from Elvish and Dwarvish, from the languages of Rohan and Harad, creating a richer and more complex means of communication. Scholars at the university studied how language changed over time, collecting regional dialects and variations, preserving older forms of speech in written records while acknowledging that living language must grow and adapt to serve the needs of those who speak it. Poetry flourished in this environment of linguistic richness, as poets drew on multiple traditions to create new forms and expressions. The Elvish influence was particularly strong in formal and literary language, lending elegance and precision, while Rohirric contributed directness and power, and the simple clarity of Hobbit speech reminded speakers that the goal of language was communication, not merely decoration. The result was a language capable of expressing both profound philosophy and simple daily needs, subtle emotion, and straightforward fact. The tradition of storytelling, which had always been important in Middle-earth, took on new significance in the Fourth Age as the generation that had lived through the War of the Ring grew older and began passing on their memories. Professional storytellers traveled from town to town, learning the histories and tales of each region, weaving them into performances that combined words and music and gesture to create experiences that engaged both mind and heart. Some stories were tragic, recounting losses and sacrifices that brought listeners to tears. Others were triumphant, celebrating victories and unlikely survivals that made people cheer. The best storytellers understood that both were necessary, that a complete story acknowledged both light and darkness, joy and sorrow, that avoiding the painful parts made the hopeful parts ring false. Children grew up hearing these stories, learning from them not just what had happened, but what it meant, what values their society held dear, what kind of people they should aspire to become. The road system throughout Gondor and its allied territories was expanded and improved during Aragorn's reign, making travel safer and more efficient than it had been in generations. The old roads had fallen into disrepair during the long years when resources went to defense rather than infrastructure, with bridges collapsed, surfaces broken, and whole sections overgrown or washed away. Teams of workers moved methodically through the kingdom, repairing and rebuilding, using techniques borrowed from dwarvish engineering to create surfaces that would last for generations. Bridges were rebuilt with stone instead of wood where possible, arched gracefully over rivers and ravines, beautiful as well as functional. Way stations were established at regular intervals, offering travelers shelter and supplies, manned by wardens who could provide information about road conditions ahead and offer aid if needed. As the roads improved, trade increased, ideas spread more rapidly, and the sense of connection between distant parts of the kingdom strengthened. The friendship between Gondor and the dwarves of Erebor deepened through the Fourth Age, fostered by mutual respect and genuine affection that had begun with Gimli's participation in the fellowship. Dwarvish craftsmen came to Gondor to share their knowledge of stoneworking and metallurgy, while Gondorian scholars traveled to Erebor to study dwarvish record-keeping and their understanding of geology and mining. The exchange benefited both peoples. Gondor's buildings became more durable and its metalwork more refined, while the dwarves gained access to Gondorian knowledge of agriculture and governance, subjects their culture had traditionally neglected. Trade caravans moved regularly between Minas, Tirith, and the Lonely Mountain, carrying goods but also letters and gifts between friends in both kingdoms. Gimli's colony in the Glittering Caves served as a bridge between the two cultures, a place where both dwarves and men felt welcome, where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. The music of the Fourth Age reflected the blending of cultures that characterized the era, incorporating elements from elvish and dwarvish traditions, from the songs of Rohan and the folk melodies of the Shire. New instruments were developed, combining the engineering precision of dwarvish craft with the tonal sensitivity of elvish music theory. Composers wrote pieces that required both human and elvish performers, taking advantage of elvish ability to hear subtle harmonics that human ears missed, while human musicians contributed emotional directness that sometimes eluded the more intellectually complex elvish approach. Concerts in Minas Tirith would draw audiences from all levels of society, from nobles in fine clothes to laborers still wearing the dust of their work, all sitting together to listen to music that transcended their differences and reminded them of their common humanity. On special occasions, visiting elvish musicians would perform songs from the elder days, and those who heard them would weep without knowing why, touched by beauty too ancient and pure for mortal hearts to bear without breaking just a little. The archives of Minas Tirith, where the records of Gondor were kept, became a treasure beyond price as the Fourth Age progressed. The archivists worked tirelessly to organize and preserve documents that stretched back thousands of years: treaties and tax records, census data and court proceedings, personal letters and official decrees. They developed new methods of preservation, learning to protect parchment from moisture and insects, to repair damaged texts, to create copies of the most fragile documents before they crumbled entirely. Scholars would spend months in the archives, tracing family lineages, researching questions of history and law, seeking understanding of how the past had shaped the present. The chief archivist was always someone who understood that these were not merely old papers, but the memory of the kingdom, that without them, Gondor would lose its sense of continuity, its connection to the generations that had come before. Every document was treated with reverence, filed carefully, indexed thoroughly, protected against fire and flood, and the simple entropy that claimed all things mortal hands created. The relationship between Gondor and Harad, once characterized by suspicion and occasional conflict, transformed during Aragorn's reign into something approaching genuine friendship. The process was slow and required patience from both sides. Generations of distrust could not be erased with a single treaty or gesture of goodwill. Aragorn sent ambassadors to the courts of Harad, bearing gifts and proposals for trade, and he received Haradrim envoys in Minas Tirith with the same courtesy he showed to allies of longer standing. Young people from both kingdoms participated in exchange programs, living for a year in the foreign land, learning the language and customs, building personal relationships that transcended political calculation. Intermarriage between Gondorians and Haradrim became more common, creating families that embodied the peace between their peoples, children who grew up speaking both languages and celebrating both cultures. The marketplace in Minas Tirith, filled with Haradrim merchants selling goods that had once been rare luxuries, while Haradrim cities saw Gondorian traders offering products from the north, and the exchange enriched both societies materially and culturally. The practice of archery, which had been primarily a military skill during the War of the Ring, became a popular sport and art form in the peaceful years that followed. Competitions were held regularly, drawing participants from across the kingdom to test their skill against targets at various distances and conditions. But archery also developed as a meditative practice, a way of training the mind as well as the body, requiring focus and calm, and the ability to release perfectionism in favor of present-moment awareness. Masters of archery spoke of the moment of release, when the arrow left the string, and the archer could only trust in their preparation and training, having no further control over the outcome. They taught that this was a metaphor for life itself, the importance of preparation combined with the necessity of letting go, of doing one's best and then accepting whatever came without clinging to desired results. Young people studying archery learned discipline and patience, learned to fail without shame and succeed without arrogance, learned that mastery was a journey rather than a destination. The gardens of Ithilien, tended by Faramir and Éowyn, with help from both mortal settlers and the elves who dwelt in the forests, became famous throughout Middle-earth for their beauty and diversity. Every kind of flowering plant that could survive in the climate was represented, arranged not in rigid formal patterns, but in designs that mimicked the organized complexity of natural landscapes. Roses climbed over arbors built from living trees, their blooms ranging from white to pink to deep crimson. Lavender grew in great swaths, filling the air with its calming scent. Fruit trees were interspersed with flowering ornamentals, providing beauty in spring and food in autumn. Water features throughout the gardens created islands of coolness. The sound of flowing water, a constant, gentle accompaniment to birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Visitors would spend hours walking the paths, finding new corners to explore, sitting on benches placed thoughtfully in spots with particularly fine views, feeling the tensions of daily life ease as the peace of the gardens seeped into their bones and breath. The study of stars and celestial movements, which had been primarily the domain of elves, attracted increasing attention from mortal scholars in the Fourth Age. Observatories were built on high towers and mountain peaks, equipped with instruments of increasing sophistication that allowed observers to track the movements of planets and stars with unprecedented precision. The scholars mapped the heavens methodically, learning to predict eclipses and conjunctions, charting the paths of wandering stars, seeking patterns in the vast dance of celestial objects. Some studied the stars for practical purposes, navigation and calendar keeping, predicting seasons and tides. Others approached it with a more philosophical bent, wondering what the existence of such vast and ancient lights might mean, whether the stars were merely burning objects or something more, whether the music of creation that the elves spoke of was metaphor or reality. The questions remained unanswered, but the asking itself felt important, a way of asserting that humans, brief as their lives were, still had the right to wonder about eternal things. The practice of keeping chronicles and journals became more widespread during the Fourth Age, encouraged by the example of the Red Book and supported by increasing literacy throughout the kingdom. Ordinary people began recording their lives, not the great deeds that would interest historians, but the small details of daily existence, the weather and harvests, births and marriages and deaths, moments of joy and sorrow that seemed significant only to those who experienced them. Taken individually, these chronicles were of limited interest, but collectively, they created a portrait of an age far more complete and honest than any official history could provide. Scholars studying these documents generations later would learn what people actually thought and felt and valued, how they spent their days, what worried them, and what gave them hope. The chronicles revealed that most lives were not shaped by great events but by small daily choices, by relationships maintained and work done well, by simple kindnesses and ordinary courage, and that this was not less valuable than the deeds of kings and heroes, but perhaps more so, being the foundation on which all else rested. The training of young people who showed talent in various crafts and arts became more formalized and accessible during Aragorn's reign. Guilds established apprenticeship programs that allowed promising youth to learn from masters regardless of their family's wealth or social position. Believing that talent deserved development and that society benefited when skilled people could fully realize their potential. A blacksmith's child might become a scholar. A nobleman's daughter might train as a healer. A farmer's son might reveal unexpected gift for music or mathematics. The increased social mobility created tensions in some quarters. Those who preferred rigid hierarchies resisted the changes, but Aragorn supported the principle that ability mattered more than birth, and gradually the culture shifted to accommodate broader opportunity. The result was a flourishing of talent and innovation, as people who would have been trapped in unsuitable roles found paths that matched their capabilities and interests. The memorial gardens created for those who had fallen in the War of the Ring became places of both mourning and healing, designed to honor loss without becoming mired in perpetual grief. Each garden incorporated the symbols or elements significant to those it memorialized. The garden for Rohirrim dead featured hardy grasses and flowers native to the plains, while the garden for Gondorian soldiers incorporated white stone and flowing water. Trees were planted as living memorials, one for each fallen warrior whose name was known, with plaques at the base identifying them and often including a brief notation of how they died or what they had been known for in life. Families would visit to tend the tree planted for their loved one, and over the years, they would watch it grow and flourish, a living continuation of a life that had been cut short. The gardens were designed to encourage contemplation rather than despair, with benches placed in quiet corners, paths that wound gently through planted areas, and sufficient beauty to remind visitors that life continued, that growth was still possible even after devastating loss. The concept of justice evolved significantly in Gondor under Aragorn's influence, moving away from purely punitive approaches toward systems that emphasized restoration and reconciliation where possible. Courts were established not just in Minas Tirith, but in major towns throughout the kingdom, ensuring that people could seek redress for grievances without traveling impossible distances. Judges were trained to consider not just the letter of the law, but the circumstances surrounding each case, to ask what outcome would best serve both the wronged party and the community as a whole. For serious crimes, punishment remained necessary, but even there, the goal shifted from mere retribution to protecting society while offering the offender a path toward redemption if they were willing to take it. The system was imperfect, as all human institutions are, but it represented a genuine attempt to create justice that served healing rather than merely satisfying anger. And over time, it helped create a society where people felt the law existed to protect them rather than to control them. The role of women in Gondorian society gradually expanded during the Fourth Age, influenced in part by Éowyn's example and Arwen's quiet advocacy. Women had always worked, of course, in homes and fields, in markets and workshops, but their contributions had often been invisible or undervalued, and many paths had been closed to them simply by virtue of their sex. Aragorn, who had learned from both his mother and from Galadriel that wisdom and courage were not limited by gender, supported changes that allowed women greater access to education and broader opportunities in trade and crafts. The shift happened slowly, against resistance from those who preferred traditional arrangements, but gradually women became healers and scholars, merchants, and even occasionally soldiers. Éowyn herself became a powerful voice for these changes, not through strident demands, but through the quiet competence with which she governed Ithilien alongside Faramir, demonstrating that leadership was not a masculine trait, but a human one, available to anyone with the wisdom and will to exercise it well. The cuisine of Gondor became more diverse and sophisticated during the peaceful years of the Fourth Age, as trade routes opened and ingredients from distant lands became available in markets throughout the kingdom. Spices from Harad that had once been rare luxuries appeared regularly in merchant stalls, and cooks experimented with incorporating them into traditional dishes, creating new flavors that delighted the palate. The influence of Rohirric cooking, with its emphasis on hearty meats and root vegetables, mingled with Gondor's more refined culinary traditions, while elvish techniques of food preservation and preparation influenced those lucky enough to learn from the few elves who remained. Feasts became more elaborate and varied, featuring multiple courses that showcased both local ingredients and exotic imports. But the changes extended beyond noble tables. Even common folk had access to a wider variety of foods than their grandparents could have imagined, and the simple pleasure of sharing a good meal became one of the small but genuine improvements in quality of life that peace made possible. The textile arts flourished in the Fourth Age, as peace allowed for the kind of patient-detailed work that war interrupted. Weavers created tapestries that depicted the great events of the age: the coronation of Aragorn, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the departure of the ring-bearers, using techniques that created images of startling depth and complexity. Natural dyes were collected from plants and minerals, creating colors that ranged from subtle earth tones to vibrant jewel shades. Patterns were developed that incorporated motifs from different cultures. The interlaced designs favored in dwarvish work, the flowing organic forms common in elvish art, the geometric precision of Númenórean tradition. Clothing became more ornate and varied, with different regions developing their own distinctive styles while also borrowing elements from neighbors. The marketplace filled with bolts of cloth in countless textures and hues, and even those of modest means could afford garments that brought beauty into their daily lives. Small luxuries that lifted spirits and reminded people that they lived in a time when such things were possible again. The institution of marriage evolved, somewhat during the Fourth Age, influenced by the various cultures that were coming into closer contact. Traditional Gondorian marriage, formal and focused on alliance and inheritance, was challenged by Rohirric practices that emphasized choice and partnership, and by Hobbit customs that made the celebration itself nearly as important as the commitment. The result was a gradual loosening of rigid requirements, with families having less absolute control over their children's choices and couples having more freedom to shape their own ceremonies and terms. Interfaith and intercultural marriages became more common and more accepted, as people from different backgrounds fell in love and chose to build lives together despite differences in custom and tradition. These marriages required more work and compromise than unions between people of similar backgrounds, but they also created families that embodied the growing unity of Middle-earth. Children who learned from birth that diversity was normal and valuable, rather than strange and threatening. The care of orphans and those without family support became a recognized responsibility of the kingdom under Aragorn's governance. Houses were established in major cities, where children who had lost parents in the war or to disease could find shelter and care. Not merely survival, but genuine nurture and education. These houses were staffed by people who understood that children needed more than food and beds. They needed affection and stability, needed to be known and valued as individuals, needed hope for futures that could be good despite difficult beginnings. Many who had fought in the war and survived felt called to this work, channeling their protective instincts toward the caring for the most vulnerable. The children raised in these houses grew up to be productive members of society, and many retained deep loyalty to Gondor and to the king who had ensured they were not abandoned. Some of the houses developed specializations, training orphans in particular trades or skills, creating pathways to self-sufficiency, and ensuring that these young people would enter adulthood with the tools they needed to build good lives. The practice of meditation and contemplation, which had been primarily associated with elves and with certain schools of learning, became more widespread among mortals during the Fourth Age. The houses of healing in Minas Tirith taught the patients techniques for calming the mind and managing pain through focused attention and controlled breathing. Scholars discovered that regular periods of quiet reflection improved their ability to think clearly and solve complex problems. Warriors found that meditation helped them process the trauma of combat and maintain emotional balance. The practice took various forms. Some sat in formal posture and silence, others walked slowly while maintaining awareness of each step. Still others used repetitive prayer or mantra to quiet the constant chatter of thought. What they shared was the recognition that the human mind needed regular rest and renewal just as the body did. That constant activity and stimulation led to exhaustion and diminished capacity. That sometimes the most productive thing one could do was simply sit quietly and breathe. The relationship between Gondor and the scattered settlements of men in the east evolved from suspicion and occasional conflict toward cautious cooperation during Aragorn's long reign. These were peoples who had lived under Sauron's shadow, some coerced into service, others deceived by lies about the West. With the Dark Lord's fall, they were released from his dominion, but left uncertain about their place in the new order. Aragorn reached out to them not with threats or demands for submission, but with offers of trade and alliance, recognizing that they too had been victims of Sauron's manipulation. Ambassadors traveled east with gifts and proposals, willing to spend years building trust that had been systematically destroyed. Some communities responded positively, grateful for a chance to join the community of free peoples. Others remained wary, their suspicion too deep to overcome quickly. But even with these, Aragorn maintained patient contact, understanding that reconciliation was measured in generations rather than years, that his role was to begin a process that his descendants would continue. The development of better agricultural techniques during the Fourth Age led to increased food security and population growth throughout Gondor and its allied territories. Farmers learned crop rotation methods that maintained soil fertility without requiring fields to lie fallow for long periods. New varieties of wheat and barley were developed through careful selection, producing higher yields while being more resistant to disease and drought. Irrigation systems were expanded, bringing water to areas that had previously been too dry for reliable cultivation. The result was prosperity that reached even remote rural areas. Fewer families went hungry, children grew taller and stronger, and the constant anxiety about whether the harvest would be sufficient eased into confidence that there would be enough. This prosperity had ripple effects throughout society, as people freed from the constant struggle for basic survival had energy and resources to invest in other pursuits, creating a flourishing of culture and learning that would have been impossible when most people's time and thought were consumed by the need to secure their next meal. The treatment of animals improved significantly during the Fourth Age, influenced by elvish philosophy and by the example of the Rohirrim's relationship with their horses. Laws were passed prohibiting unnecessary cruelty, establishing standards for the care of working animals, and creating penalties for those who abused creatures under their control. The change reflected a growing recognition that kindness and cruelty in one sphere of life affected behavior in others, that people who treated animals with casual brutality were more likely to be harsh with other humans as well, that cultivation of compassion in any form strengthened it in all forms. Farmers discovered that animals treated with gentleness and respect were healthier and more productive than those driven by fear and violence. Children raised to care for animals developed empathy and responsibility. The shift was not complete or universal. Old habits persisted, and some resisted what they saw as sentimental interference with practical necessity. But the trajectory was clear, moving toward a society that valued mercy and recognized the intrinsic worth of all living things. The tradition of pilgrimage developed during the Fourth Age, with people journeying to sites significant in the War of the Ring, to honor those who had fought and fallen, to see for themselves the places where history had been made. The Pelennor Fields became a destination for those who wanted to stand where the Rohirrim had charged and where Theoden had fallen. Mount Mindalluin attracted visitors who climbed to see where Aragorn had found the White Tree. Even the Grey Havens, though distant and requiring weeks of travel, drew those who wished to stand where the ring-bearers had departed to look west toward the undying lands that they themselves could never reach. These pilgrimages served multiple purposes. They honored memory. They connected people to history larger than their individual lives. They created shared experience among travelers from different regions and backgrounds. The journey itself became as significant as the destination, as pilgrims walked together, shared stories and meals, formed friendships that continued after they returned home. The paths they walked became worn with countless feet, marked with cairns and shrines, threaded with the prayers and thoughts of all who had passed that way. The art of cartography advanced significantly as the Fourth Age progressed, driven by increased trade and travel and supported by more sophisticated instruments for measuring distance and direction. Map makers traveled throughout the known world, carefully charting coastlines and rivers, mountains and forests, cities and roads. The maps they created were more accurate than any that had existed before, showing not just approximate locations but precise relationships between places, including information about terrain and climate that helped travelers plan their routes. The royal archives in Minas Tirith held the master copies, but reproductions were distributed to libraries and administrative centers throughout the kingdom. Looking at these maps, people could see the full extent of the realm, could understand how different regions related to each other, could imagine journeys they might never take, but could now conceive as real possibilities. The maps changed how people thought about space and distance, making the world simultaneously larger, because they could see how much of it remained unexplored, and smaller, because known places became more accessible, no longer vague rumors, but definite locations that could be reached by anyone willing to walk the necessary roads. The music of mourning, which had been essential during and immediately after the war, gradually transformed during the peaceful years of the Fourth Age. The early songs had been raw with grief, focused on loss and sacrifice, on the high cost of victory. As time passed and the immediate pain dulled, the music evolved to incorporate not just sorrow but also gratitude and celebration of the lives that had been lived. Memorial services began to include not only lamentation, but also sharing of happy memories, stories about the deceased that made listeners laugh even as they wiped away tears. Musicians developed new forms that acknowledged complexity, songs that held both grief and joy, that honored both what was lost and what was preserved, that recognized death as inevitable while still protesting its unfairness. The evolution reflected a healthy process of healing, moving from acute pain toward integration of loss, finding ways to carry the dead with them, not as burdens that prevented forward movement, but as presences that enriched and informed how they chose to live. The development of public parks and green spaces in Minas Tirith and other cities reflected a growing understanding that people needed access to nature even in urban environments. Spaces that had been used for military purposes during the war were converted into gardens and plazas where people could gather and relax. Trees were planted along streets, providing shade in summer and beauty in all seasons. Fountains and pools were installed in public squares, their sound soothing and their presence cooling the air on hot days. Children played in these spaces, their laughter echoing off stone walls, while elders sat on benches watching them, remembering their own childhoods. The parks became gathering places for communities, locations where neighbors encountered each other naturally, where relationships formed and strengthened through casual, repeated contact. The investment in these spaces was not merely aesthetic but social, recognizing that human beings needed beauty and nature and informal connection with others, that cities built only for efficiency and commerce failed to meet fundamental human needs. The tradition of storytelling circles, where people gathered specifically to share tales and listen to each other, became formalized and widespread during the Fourth Age. Every village and neighborhood had its own circle, meeting regularly, some weekly, others monthly, with participation open to anyone who wished to come. The rules were simple. Everyone who wanted to tell a story got their turn. Listeners gave respectful attention, and the stories themselves could be anything: personal experiences, traditional tales, newly invented fictions, historical accounts. The circles served multiple functions simultaneously. They entertained, they educated, they preserved memory, they built community bonds, they gave people practice in public speaking and in attentive listening. Elders found audiences for the wisdom accumulated over their lifetimes. Young people learned history in engaging form rather than as dry recitation. Shy individuals discovered they had voices worth hearing. The stories shared ranged from profound to trivial, from polished performances to halting first attempts. But all were honored because all came from genuine human experience and imagination. The study of languages, which had always been important for scholars and diplomats, became more widespread as peace and increased travel made communication across cultures more common and more necessary. Schools began teaching not just literacy in Westron, but also basic competency in other tongues. Sindarin for those who might encounter the few remaining elves, Kusdu for those trading with dwarves, Rohirric for those with business in the Riddermark. The study revealed that language shaped thought in subtle ways, that different tongues made certain ideas easy to express and others difficult, that learning a new language meant learning a new way of seeing the world. Bilingual and multilingual individuals often reported feeling like slightly different people when speaking different languages, as though each tongue brought forth different aspects of their personality. This linguistic diversity enriched culture and understanding, making it harder to dehumanize those who spoke differently, easier to recognize that various ways of being in the world all had validity and value. The night sky above Minas Tirith, unpolluted by the kind of light and smoke that would characterize later industrial ages, offered a spectacle of stars that city dwellers in later times would never see. On clear nights, the Milky Way stretched like a river of light across the heavens, and the constellations told their ancient stories to anyone who knew how to read them. Arendil's star, the light that Galadriel had captured in the file she gave to Frodo, shone in the west at evening, a reminder of hope and of the connection between Middle-earth and the undying lands. People would gather on rooftops and hilltops to watch meteor showers, making wishes on falling stars, or to observe the wandering stars. Planets whose movements traced patterns that repeated across years and decades. The stars provided both practical utility for navigation and timekeeping, and also wonder, a reminder of the vastness of creation and the smallness of human concerns within it. Looking up at them, even the greatest king or the poorest beggar stood equal, both tiny beneath the ancient lights, both part of something far larger than their individual lives. The healing of relationships damaged by the war proved more difficult and prolonged than the healing of physical wounds. But it, too, progressed through the Fourth Age. Families that had been separated or that had lost members learned to reconfigure around absence, to maintain connection with those who had survived, to create new traditions that honored both past and present. Friendships that had been forged in combat faced the challenge of translating battlefield bonds into peacetime connection, finding that removing the shared danger also removed the easy basis for relationship, requiring more intentional effort to maintain. Some succeeded, meeting regularly to share meals and conversation, supporting each other through the normal difficulties of life. Others drifted apart, not from animosity, but simply because the intensity that had connected them was impossible to sustain in ordinary circumstances. Communities that had been devastated by war rebuilt not just their physical structures, but their social fabric, recreating networks of mutual support and shared celebration that gave life texture and meaning beyond mere survival. The legacy of the War of the Ring extended far beyond its immediate participants, shaping the Fourth Age in ways both obvious and subtle. The victory over Sauron had proved that evil could be defeated, that courage and endurance mattered, that even when darkness seemed overwhelming, resistance was worthwhile. This knowledge changed how people faced challenges in their own lives. They drew strength from the example of those who had refused to surrender when surrender would have been easier, who had kept walking when every step was agony, who had chosen to do what was right even when the cost was terrible. The story became a touchstone, a reference point for conversations about ethics and courage, a reminder that individuals could make a difference even when forces arrayed against them seemed impossibly powerful. Parents told their children about the hobbits who saved the world, about the king who had wandered in exile before claiming his throne, about the fellowship that held together despite all odds, and in the telling, they passed on values and aspirations that shaped how the next generation understood what it meant to live well. The end of the Third Age and the beginning of the Fourth marked a transition not just in chronology but in the fundamental nature of Middle-earth. The age of elves and magic gave way to the age of men and reason. The extraordinary faded to make room for the ordinary, and the world became at once smaller and more completely the domain of mortal peoples. Some mourned this change, feeling that something precious and irreplaceable was being lost. Others embraced it, seeing opportunity in the freedom from ancient powers and constraints. Both perspectives held truth. The passing of the elves took beauty and wisdom from the world that would never be replaced. But it also allowed humanity to find its own path, to succeed or fail on its own merits, rather than living forever in the shadow of greater beings. The Fourth Age was an age of potential, of possibility, of a world waiting to see what mortals would make of it, now that they stood on their own feet, guided by their own wisdom, responsible for their own choices and their consequences. The white tree continued to bloom in the court of the fountain through all the years of Aragorn's reign, and long after, standing as a living symbol of renewal and continuity. Each spring, it would cover itself in white blossoms that filled the air with fragrance subtle and sweet, and people would come just to stand near it and breathe deeply, feeling some tension ease that they hadn't fully realized they were carrying. Birds loved the tree, nesting in its branches, their songs echoing through the citadel. The tree became a meeting place, a landmark, a part of the city's identity as fundamental as the white stone itself. Children grew up playing near it, lovers pledged their troth beneath it, and dying individuals sometimes asked to be carried to see it one final time. It stood through seasons and years and generations, growing slowly, deepening its roots, reaching higher, a promise kept across centuries that some good things endure, that life persists, that renewal is always possible even after the darkest winter. Middle-earth turned through its seasons, year following year, in the patient rhythm that had existed since the world's beginning, and would continue long after all who had fought in the War of the Ring had passed into memory and legend. Spring brought renewal. Green shoots pushing through soil, birds returning from southern migrations, the world shaking off winter's sleep and stretching toward the sun. Summer brought abundance, long days of work and growth, fields heavy with grain, orchards bending under the weight of fruit, life in its fullness. Autumn brought harvest and preparation, the gathering of what had been grown, the storing against coming scarcity, leaves turning gold and red before falling. Winter brought rest and darkness, snow covering the land in silence, fires burning in hearths while families gathered close, the world sleeping and dreaming of spring. The cycle continued, indifferent to human concerns yet fundamental to human survival, a rhythm older than kingdoms and deeper than any individual life. The heartbeat of the world itself, steady and sure, carrying all things forward into whatever future would unfold. One season, one day, one breath at a time.